Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today it is time to tackle perhaps the most iconic weapon, not just in 40k, but in science fiction history, the Chainsword. For who in their right mind would not admire the brutalistic beauty of a weaponized chainsaw wielded by a 2-ton heavy super soldier? It just does not get any better than that. And so, over the course of this video, we are going to have a look at this most glorious of weapons, its history, its lore, and, because why not, whether or not the Chainsword could ever be a realistic combat weapon. Because again, why wouldn't you want a chainsword? Indeed, let us start on the could it work in real life part, because it will also serve as a very nice introduction to a lot of the lore, seeing as there are 3 major problems with having a real life chainsword, all of which are solved in the far distant science fiction future of the 41st millennium. And these 3 problems are weight, edge, and durability. Let's start with the first and most obvious one. A chainsaw is heavy. Real damn heavy. Not only do you have to contend, of course, with the housing and the chain, but most importantly of all, the engine. And if you want this chain to be spinning at the kind of speed and power required to cut through flesh, bone, and possibly body armor, you are going to need a rather hefty one. To put it into a bit of perspective, a light chainsaw is probably going to be weighing in at about 2.5 to 3 kilograms. That is more than most medieval swords. And a big chainsaw can easily weigh up to 9 kilos. That is far more than a bowling ball. Now try imagining wielding something like that, one-handed, with most of the weight centered right around the hilt. Oh yeah, you're gonna be getting a workout alright. And also bear in mind that these are just modern day chainsaws, designed to essentially grind away at something rather than cut or slice it. A rather vital difference which we will be getting back to later, but if you wanted to have a chainsaw able to actually tear through flesh and bone, bearing in mind that human bone is actually a surprisingly tough substance, especially when enveloped with all of that nice gooey muscle and such on, and you also want to be able to essentially slice through a target using this, you are going to need an engine capable of way higher RPM and far more traction as well than any modern day chainsaw. This would, unsurprisingly, result in a very heavy and very unwieldy weapon. It would severely limit the user's range of motion and speed just to maintain a modicum of control over the weapon. This is not something you want to be taking wide swings with, because if you miss, the weapon's probably going to be swinging you for a while. Which leads us on to our second point, edge. And this is a vital one. Remember the distinction between cutting and grinding effects? A chainsaw functions via a sawing motion, where you deliver 1,000 of tiny little individual cuts to an object and essentially grinding through it. Whereas with a cutting tool, like a sword, what you are doing is taking all of the kinetic energy of the weapon and focusing it all along a very thin edge, allowing you to deal the maximum amount of energy to the smallest possible surface, thereby slicing and cutting deep into an object. And theoretically, you could create a chainsaw where the individual teeth spin so quickly, with so much force, and they are so sharp, as to deliver that devastating cutting force over and over and over and over again, ripping through the target's body and evicting the gory result out in a spray of splatter, which, by the way, could be another issue as well, especially if the chain is rotating towards you. You best be wearing a face-plated helmet, that's all I'm going to say on that point. But if you were able to achieve this, you would then have a chainsword capable of seemingly slicing through a target. It would still be 1,000 minor cuts, but each cut is delivered with such tremendous force as to quite literally just rip through the target, giving very little resistance against the blade. But this would of course either require a tremendously powerful engine capable of delivering the sheer raw amount of kinetic force required with each and every cut, or you would need monstrously sharp teeth to reduce the impact and the friction of each individual slice. And on the topic of teeth, that brings us to the third point. Durability. And this is a bit of a two-parter. First and foremost, you remember that whole thing about if the chain is moving towards you, you better be wearing a face-plated helmet? Well, that also goes for the sword. The thing here is, the teeth will have to be revolving around the blade, which means there needs to be enough of an opening for the chainsaw teeth to actually enter into the housing and spin around it. This means that in the case of hitting something living, blood, guts, and tissue might also be dragged in there. That's gonna choke up an engine real quick, it is. And so you're either going to have an engine robust enough to hold through and clean itself out by evicting the offending pieces of orc, presumably, or having the blade spin so quickly as to just throw it off the individual teeth. Ideally, you would have a little bit of both. And the teeth, that is another key point. For the old saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, would absolutely hold true for a chainsaw. Each and every one of those little cutting teeth, and the way in which it is linked to the revolving belt, are all going to be placed under a tremendous deal of stress. If you were to take a sword and start whacking away at a shield or a piece of armor, for example, or another weapon, the sword is going to start getting chipped, it's going to start getting damaged, and in worst case scenario, it might bend or break. Now imagine all of that stress being taken out on a tiny little rotating tooth a couple thousand times per minute, as it spins super rapidly, impacting upon an opponent's weapons, armor, and flesh, again and again, as mentioned, thousands of times a minute. And just as a little bit of a side note, what do you think happens to a tiny little chainsaw tooth that gets knocked loose of its chain? The chain, again, spinning very, very quickly. Well, again, I really hope you're wearing quite a lot of armor whilst wielding this weapon, because the word shrapnel comes to mind an awful lot. And so, bearing all this in mind, unfortunately, no. The chainsword is not a very realistic real-life weapon. Don't get me wrong, if you hit someone with it, they're probably dead. But all in all, you'd be far better off with just a good old-fashioned sword. Of course, we could get around some of the limitations by changing the shape of it. A chain glaive, for example, would be a far more effective weapon for a regular human being, because you'll be less affected by the severe restraints upon your range of motion when you're just poking with it, and the enemy is also going to have considerably less options when you have a weapon that is presumably longer than his. I mean, again, if you just get a hold of him, even just for a second, those teeth will dig in and quite literally pull the victim onto the weapon as they rotate. Nasty, nasty nonsense. But sadly, again, not very practical, because at the end of the day, you could achieve pretty much the same results with just a spear. Having a spear that's also a chainsaw is, at best, glorious, yet also somewhat wasteful overkill. But in the 41st millennium, however, it's not quite the same thing. Let us look at the three primary problems again, but this time in the 41st millennium. Starting, of course, with weight. All of the components are generally lighter in the far future. Materials like adamantite, for example, are far stronger than steel, and yet also considerably lighter. And as for the biggest problem when it comes to weight, the engine, well, the 41st millennium is capable of generating laser beams capable of cracking open planets. Constructing a better chainsaw engine is goddamn facile. And not only are the engines mounted on the chainswords of the far future much lighter, they are also way more powerful. They are actually capable of propelling the belt, and therefore the teeth, at the speed required to slice through a target so quickly as to let the chainsword dig in deep and actually cut, rather than just grinding through something. Now, misunderstand me correctly, a chainsword would still be a heavy-ass weapon, probably considerably heavier than what would be considered practical in our own history. We're talking about probably somewhere between the lines of 3 to 5 or possibly even more kilos. And whilst that may not necessarily sound like that much, when you think about that this is a weapon you are supposed to be wielding in combat for an extended period of time, oh, that starts getting heavy real quick. However, once again we return to the idea of practicality. In medieval combat, you would never need something this heavy. You wouldn't need a sword that weighs in at 5 kilograms. But that's fighting people. In the far distant future, there are far worse things than humans bumping around the galaxy. And when you're facing off against an orc, or a traitor Chaos Space Marine, or a Tyranid monstrosity, that doubling in weight seems like a damn good trade-off for the increased killing potential of a chainsword. And as for materiel, well, yet again, the 41st millennium is infinitely superior to anything we have in our mundane reality. Adamantite is a very useful substance. As mentioned, it is both stronger and lighter than pretty much anything we have, and the technology also exists to hone it to a monomolecular edge. This means that it is so thin it can literally slip in between the atoms. And as the blade grows slowly but surely thicker, it will start peeling them apart, which cuts at the absolute smallest level imaginable, introducing a weapon that is capable of cutting with practically no friction or resistance. The materials of the far future are also very durable, but due to the fact that such super hard alloys exist in the first place, one must also assume that other weapons are made of the same alloy, and armor as well, of course. Therefore, there is still plenty of wear and tear on chainswords. And not all chainswords are made from the highest end material. Some may even be produced from more base materials, like steel alloys, for example, relying instead on the power of the engine to make up for the lacking cutting force of the original teeth. Indeed, in some sources, although this varies a little bit, the chainsaw is one of those things that have been represented in so many books, in so many variants, that there are a lot of differentials included. For example, in the Horus Heresy, there is a mention of a chainsaw with a second set of teeth, which are made of a tougher alloy that can be slotted in alongside the first set to give the weapon an armor-piercing mode. Now, this sounds a little bit superfluous, as in the case of a weapon like that, you'd probably just put on the armor-piercing chain to begin with, because I'm sure it would be equally effective against regular people, and with it being wielded by a space marine, weight isn't really much of an issue, and again, if you're going to be putting it on there regardless, but just in addition to a second belt, weight is really not the issue. And, of course, the third and final point, durability, which we have already to some extent addressed. The materials in the far future are far better at both holding an edge and avoid getting damaged, but with the availability of these materials, the enemy's weaponry and armor may also possess the same near unbreakable qualities, resulting in quite a bit of wear and tear nevertheless. This is why replacement parts are made aplenty for these weapons. Replacements, chains, teeth, engines, and even full housing are shipped off in vast quantities to any formation that utilizes such weaponry. But, of course, replacement parts are only worthwhile if you actually have the time to replace them, and chainswords are quite vulnerable to in-field degradation because, as mentioned, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and in this case, it is often the link between the chain itself and the teeth. It is far from unusual for a chainsword to shed several teeth when clashing against enemy weapons, armor, and especially against other chainswords. But with that said, one should also bear in mind that the durability of a chainsword is very much so relative as well. If you're trying to tear through ceramite armor plating, or smashing it against another person using a chainsword or a power weapon, then yes, the degradation is going to be rather severe and rather quick. If, however, you're using this against relatively lightly armored opponents, or even unarmored enemies, or wielding it against just normal swords and cudgels, then the chainsword will cut through those effortlessly, and the damage to the weapon will be minimal, if any at all. And with the three primary problems solved, a chainsword is absolutely plausible in the 41st millennium, and also desirable, for a reason that we'll get to in a little bit. But first, let's finally have a little bit of a look at the history of the chainsword, shall we? Because its origin is not what you might expect. On the screen for a while now, you've been seeing a beautiful Sister of Battle armed with a chainsword, and a bunch of different variations as well, but the first people to actually use a chain weapon, as far as we know anyways, was not humanity, but instead the Eldar. Now, you might immediately make the reasonable point that the brutal, roaring majesty of a chainsword seems ill-matched with the effeminate, knife-eared form of the space elf, but the chain weapons of the Eldar are wielded by a very special subset of space elf, the Striking Scorpions, one of the Eldar's aspect warriors and, if I am to be honest, the most kick-ass of all of the aspect warriors. Which is why it is such a shame we never got to see them in any Dawn of War titles. And I dare you to contradict me on that one, because they were never seen in a Dawn of War title. Heavy emphasis on the Dawn of War part. But who are the Striking Scorpions, and what makes them so special from all of the other knife-ears? You may not know, because I haven't actually made a video on them yet, which both frightens and disappoints me, frankly, and it's certainly something I'm going to be getting on. But till then, the Scorpions eschew the faggoty fighting form favoured by effeminate banshees, who prefer to strike from cover, concealment, or ambush, and then stun the enemy with their howling banshee masks. Instead, the Scorpions act more like Space Marines, wandering quite happily into the enemy fire, trusting in their artfully crafted armour plates that shift as they move through cover to protect them from incoming enemy fire. And when they get up close and personal, that armor once again allows them to simply take the enemy's hits whilst lashing out with their own elegantly curved chainswords in return. They are a far more brutal, murderous, butchering kind of warrior than the elegant queerness of the howling banshees. And it is up close and massed melee that the chainsword truly excels. Whereas the powered blade of the Howling Banshees will slice through armor like butter, it delivers a fine slice, a deep razor-sharp cut. It must be placed with a great deal of precision to be instantaneously lethal to a foe, especially the kind of shit that goes bump in the night of the 41st millennium. Whereas a chainsword, whilst the elegantly curved weapons of the Striking Scorpions are a far deal more dainty than those wielded by the Space Marines or the Imperial Guard, the tearing, ripping effect of the chain itself remains precisely the same. This is not a weapon that requires any kind of grace or elegance, or precision in its implementation. If you so much as grace an enemy with this thing, it will rip chunks out of their flesh the size of fists. And nothing bleeds like a chainsword wound. You don't have to kill in one hit with a chainsword. The sheer shock and pain trauma will render almost any opponent combat ineffective immediately. And once he can no longer hurt you, it doesn't matter whether or not he bleeds to death over the course of the next few seconds or a minute or two. And this is the reason why a chainsword in the 41st millennium is not merely plausible, but desirable. It is not merely a flight of sci-fi fancy, some ridiculously over-designed or ludicrous weapon with no real-life applications. A common sword cannot do what a chainsword can. If you're fighting an orc that might be standing head and shoulders above you, a maddened, brutish monstrosity made from nothing but muscles and anger, you absolutely need a weapon capable of delivering the absurd overkill trauma of a chainsword. Because again, this is not a weapon that requires any kind of prolonged contact with an opponent. Imagine for a second just, again, grazing someone with this thing. With the chainsaw teeth pointing towards you, it will pull the weapon into the enemy target. It will bury itself hungrily in the flesh of your foe, and every single teeth, every single one that hits the target with hundreds of slices each and every goddamn second will be tearing gouges out of him. It will be ripping the wound wider and wider, increasing the trauma, increasing the pain, and increasing the bleeding. Even a space marine, genetically modified to know no fear, and to have his body heal itself from almost any injury, is not going to be walking away in one piece after getting hit by a chainsword. And if it can kill a space marine, it can kill pretty much anything out there. Whereas a sword... You try hitting an orc, or an Adeptus Astartes with a piece of sharpened metal. You might do a little bit of damage, you might deliver a shallow cut, before your dainty little piece of steel is buried to an unrecoverable degree in transhuman flesh. And then what do? Your opponent is most definitively not combat ineffective. And the primary emotion running through his mind at that point isn't going to be pain, it's just going to be even more anger. And now you're within an arm's length of him. Yeah, I bet you wish you'd used the chainsword instead. The plain and simple truth is, in a universe like 40k, yes, a chainsword is still going to be far more unwieldy than a normal sword. It's still going to be heavier, it's still going to be damn dangerous both to the enemy and the wielder, and it's still going to limit your range of motions quite considerably. But if a sword literally can't kill the thing you're fighting, all of those drawbacks are entirely immaterial. And even if it wasn't the case that you needed the rending, ravaging destruction of a chain weapon, even if that wasn't strictly necessary, with the main drawbacks of the weapon solved by technological advancements, a chainsword has a host of advantages over a non-motorized weapon. Not least of which is, of course, the sheer pucker factor induced in your opponent when he finds himself opposite a roaring, smoke-belching, oil-stinking chainsword. The morale effect of such a weapon should never be underestimated, especially not in the hands of something like a space marine. But beyond that, beyond having the weapon itself be the scariest goddamn thing the poor bastard you're fighting has ever seen, it also has some other advantages as well. We've already talked about the destructive properties of a chainsword, and if you even so much as graze your opponent, it's probably over. But there are a few other ones as well. We already mentioned that if you manage to hit someone with the chain spinning towards you, you will quite literally pull the weapon into your opponent. It will dig in and eviscerate them. But chainswords are able to reverse the direction of the teeth. At the very least, some models are. Indeed, there was mentioned in the Gaunt's Ghost model that this was a key part of chainsword dueling, which it was also mentioned was a remarkably volatile form of dueling, which I can believe, because when you've got two regular humans, every time these weapons clash, or you parry with the spinning side, both of these weapons will be churning against one another. All of those little impacts will reverberate up the hands of the wielders. It requires every ounce of strength a man has with a two-handed grip just to control the weapon, and if you then suddenly throw it into reverse, or gun the chain extra fast, those are yet further variables. And here's another thing. If you hit a normal weapon with the chains running, it will pull it down the chain and probably crush it against the handguard. And if you reverse the chains so that the chainsaw's teeth is spinning away from you, if you hit the enemy's weapon, it will be struck by all of those tiny little blows continuously. If your opponent is not prepared for that, it will in all due likelihood toss his guard wide open in the best case scenario, or simply see his weapon skidding across the floor in the worst case. Basically, if you don't have a chain weapon of your own, or a power weapon, you don't parry a chainsword. You just don't. You dodge it or you die. Those are your options. And of course, there are many variants of chainswords as well, so let's wrap up the video by talking about some of these different variations, shall we? One of the earliest chain weapons we know of in Imperial records is the chain blade. This was a far smaller chain weapon, usually attached as bayonets to early issue bolt guns. Because why the fuck not? This eventually evolved into the more usual chainswords that we see now. They were a weapon primarily used by the Legiones Astartes, superhuman warriors designed to go out into the galaxy and kill anything they came across. And a weapon like the chainsword was just about brutal enough to fit the bill. Later on, when the Legiones Astartes were no longer the primary fighting force of the Imperium, smaller, more handleable versions were created for the newly formed Imperial Guard, as they slowly but surely took over the responsibilities of protecting the Imperium of Man, although that was not by any extent of the imagination the end of its evolution. Indeed, many of the legions, or now chapters, have developed their very own types of chain weaponry. For example, the Space Wolves possess the infamous Frost Blade, weapons crafted from the diamond-hard teeth of massive undersea krakens. Less esoterical, yet nevertheless specialized versions can be found in the hands of many other legions as well, like the Redemptor pattern wielded by the Blood Angels, or the Mark II Errant chainsword used by the Marines Errant, or the Gore Prow, quite the name on that one, used by the Firehawks. There are also variants on the regular chainsaw that is specifically designed to be operated by humans. For example, you have the Hydrapur pattern chainsword, a shorter, more maneuverable version of a chain weapon often favoured by naval armsmen. And of course, there are also a bit more, special adaptations as well. Chain weapons come in many shapes, forms, and sizes too. With size being one of the most important factors here, because whilst there are a lot of insane variants that are, well, just flat out ridiculous, like for example the chain hammer. Yes, indeed. You also have some that are simply just massive, but with a certain purpose for them. For example, the Eviscerator, so favoured by the Sisters Repentia of the Adepta Sororitas, a weapon often given out to, as the name suggests, pentient members of the Order who are expected to throw themselves into the thickest of the fighting, sacrificing their own lives whilst wielding massive double-handed chainswords. Because whilst the sisters aren't expected to walk away from the engagement, the enemy sure as hell isn't either. And that's nowhere near the end of Offensively Massive. There are chain weapons designed for dreadnoughts, knights, and even, indeed, titans. Even I think that's probably a little bit overkill, but oh well. And of course there are more utilitarian versions like the Chain Fist, a weapon designed more for breaching actions aboard space hulks rather than necessarily fighting, although of course if you hit somebody with it, they're still going to be awfully dead, so in a pinch certainly. And by far the most worthwhile and useful variant of a chain weapon, at least in my opinion, the Chain Glaive or Chain Spear. This weapon solves one of the biggest issues of a chain weapon, namely the problem of controlling the damn thing and the limits it places upon your ability to swing the bastard. And since again, in all due reality, a chain weapon doesn't actually have to really hit something to do damage, a graze will do, placing it at the top of a very long stick seems like the natural thing to do. Unfortunately, however, chain glaives and spears have a little bit of a nasty reputation. They have been utilized by less than savory elements of the 41st millennium. Cough, knight, cough, lords. And so their use is often frowned upon in, godly circles. But I've always been one for stating that it doesn't have to be pretty, as long as it works, and, well, if the Imperium didn't agree with that, they wouldn't have placed a chain fist on a Titan, now would they? Anywho, I will wrap it up there. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like the content, please do consider sharing it around, because it does help an awful lot. And, of course, I hope to see you all again next time, since I've had a little bit more of a deviation from the usual formula with this one. I've been wanting to talk about chainswords for a long time now, but I actually recorded a more flat-up lore video, and it ended up being like 10 minutes, just talking about the different types, how it functions. It runs on Prometheum, by the way, most of the time, which you'd think they'd come up with better battery solutions in the far future, but hey, Prometheum is cool as well, and it is extraordinarily volatile, just like the people likely to wield these monstrous weapons, so I suppose there's some kind of symbiosis going on there. So I decided to go for a bit more of a how does it work? Would it work? Could it work? And why would one actually use it, even if it could work instead? So, hopefully, it hasn't been too disappointing. Until next time, have a good day.